Okay, so thank you so much for coming tonight. I am Jamie Lyons-Eddy, one of the co-founders and now Director of Campaigns and Programs for Voters Not Politicians, which is the nonpartisan grassroots group that brought thousands of Michiganders together to end partisan gerrymandering in our state. Today, we're here to talk about the historic victory that the citizens of Michigan won to fix our broken redistricting process. But most of all, I'm going to ask you to take part in what's coming next. We think the biggest lesson of 2018, with all those citizen-led initiatives winning in Michigan by huge margins, that lesson is that democracy only works when ordinary citizens show up. And we have to show up not just once, but again and again. So let's start tonight with how incredible it is that we're even here. When the people of Michigan started to get together to clean up the corruption in our elections, the conventional wisdom said, you can't do it, it can't be done. The experts said, you'll never get on the ballot, you won't get enough signatures. But then we did. The experts said, the establishment's too powerful, they'll fight you in court and you won't win. But then we did. And they said, you're just grassroots volunteers up against special interests and you'll never be able to reach enough people to spread the word. But with the help of an amazing TV campaign and knocking 465,000 doors, we did. And it turns out that 2.5 million Michiganders agreed, and we, the voters, passed Proposal 2 with over 61% of the vote in Michigan. Even though we did what many thought was impossible, and the amendment survived a Michigan Supreme Court challenge and then got overwhelming support from voters at the polls, we are still not done. We have to keep participating because this process will only work if thousands of voters from all over the state of different ages and backgrounds and different viewpoints apply for the commission in a spirit of service to all the residents of our great state. We also need people all over Michigan to understand the process so they're confident in the new maps that Michigan will use for the 2022 elections. So it's time to show that the voters of Michigan are ready to do what it takes to protect our democracy. It starts with redistricting. That means drawing the lines that tell you what district you vote in. It's fundamental to our democracy. In fact, it's even right at the beginning of the United States Constitution. Districts have to have equal population, so every congressional district in America has roughly the same number of people in it. And because people move around, populations change, so we have a census every 10 years to count every single person. That means every 10 years, states have to redraw the maps of the districts. So the districts we're talking about here are for the United States Congress, for the state Senate, and for the state House of Representatives. Just to clarify, your address places you in particular voting districts. So this star right here represents actually my house in Troy, and the blue lines form Michigan House District 41. That actually contains Troy and Clawson. This is my state Senate district. So my state Senate district is number 13 because that's the one that my house happens to be in. I'm also in the beautiful 11th US Congressional District. Something funny is going on with that shape, don't you think? So we're going to talk about that pretty soon. First, for some perspective though, let's zoom out to the state of Michigan. So those are the same districts I just showed you around my house in Troy. There are 110 Michigan House districts in the state, so those are pretty small. There are 38 state Senate districts, so they're a little bit bigger. And there are currently 14 United States congressional districts in Michigan. Districts are different sizes depending on population density. So the census provides population counts, and then the state uses that data to redraw election district maps so they have equal numbers of people. Seems pretty straightforward, right? But it turns out if you give politicians the power to draw those lines, that means the politicians can choose their voters, which is really the opposite of what democracy is about. It's called gerrymandering. It's the political manipulation of voting maps so politicians can pick their voters and give themselves and their party an unfair advantage at the polls. They use sophisticated computer programs and data to predict how people will vote, and then they draw lines around the voters to determine which party is more likely to win. These are just some of the maps that those politicians came up with. The reason they snake and twist around is to divide and conquer communities, so the communities don't have a strong voice. And then the lines politicians draw can skew the results of the elections for the whole next decade. So here's a quick example. Imagine we have a state of 49 people. Yeah, it's a pretty small state, I know, but it helps to simplify the situation for this demonstration. So let's say that 24 people in this state vote for green candidates. 25 of them like yellow candidates. So since it's 49 people, let's say we've got 7 districts in this state, each with 7 people. So if we drew those districts, we had 7 districts, how many should yellow win out of the 7, and how many should green win? I'll let you think about that for a second. Right, just as we'd expect, yellow does have 1 extra seat, but it's pretty close, and the representation matches the voters. So yellow gets 4 seats, green gets 3, everything seems pretty fair here. But what if the people controlling the map drawing process have their own agenda? If the green politicians had the power to gerrymander, if they're holding the pens that draw the map, they can go behind closed doors and they can do this. They can win 6 seats to 1. These are all the same people. They didn't change their mind. They didn't move their house. What happened was the people who wanted green to win clustered a whole bunch of yellow voters into 1 district. So you can see it right there near the upper right corner of Jerryland. Doesn't seem bad at first, right? I mean, yellow gets their whole district to themselves. But the problem is with so many yellow voters in that 1 district, there aren't enough yellow voters left to win a single other district. It's called packing and cracking, and you can see evidence of it in many real voting districts all around Michigan. Just in case you thought there was something special about this particular arrangement of people, yellow can do the same thing. They can get the same outcome for themselves of a 6-to-1 map. It's all about who has the power to draw the maps. This is gerrymandering, where the politicians pick their voters instead of the other way around. So technically, these districts are all the same size. They're 7 people, but letting one party draw the lines means they can manipulate the whole thing by clustering together the other side and changing the outcome so it no longer reflects the will of the voters. So this was the sorry state of things that many of you attending this webinar saw, and then we knew we had to do something about it. So in 2018, Michiganders amended the state constitution to end gerrymandering and create a fair, impartial, and transparent process to draw the lines. It's a process that will be led by citizens, taking the power away from politicians and putting it right where it belongs, in the hands of voters like us. So here's how it works. There'll be 13 Michigan voters who will serve on the commission. Excuse me. There'll be 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and then 5 people unaffiliated with either of the major parties. They'll draw the lines using very strict criteria. And one of those criteria is that the maps can't favor a political party, a candidate, or an incumbent. They have to do this out in the open with public meetings so communities can speak up about how they should be represented. The commission can hire whatever staff they need. They can hire experts, programmers, whatever. Because the point is that final maps can only be approved by a consensus across party lines. Remember, the commission is made up of 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and 5 who don't align with either of those parties. For final approval, not only do a majority of the commissioners have to agree, so that's 7 out of 13, but to make sure there's a real compromise, 2 votes from each of those groups is required to approve the final maps. So you need 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and at least 2 of those who don't align with either party in order to approve the maps. What this means is that you have to have agreement, you have to have consensus in order to adopt the maps. This process will be much better than Michigan's old process. We're really sure about this because other independent commissions have already been shown to work. Obviously, these independent commissions reduce gerrymandering, the problem that we just talked about. Communities that have no representation, they've had no representation in the past, and then no recourse to fix the situation can finally be represented when fair maps are drawn to reflect communities of interest. Independent redistricting commissions have been shown in many cases to increase competition in districts and then to improve public satisfaction with the way their voting districts are drawn. And no set of voting maps that's been drawn by an independent citizens commission has ever been thrown out in court. 4 different independent studies found that California's first set of commission drawn maps met all of the requirements. They respected communities of interest, they followed the requirements and processes that were called out in their constitution, and they complied with the Voting Rights Act. So, what kind of person would make a good redistricting commissioner? How about a person like you? If the people of Michigan show up and they apply to be part of this process, we'll end up with a commission that represents the different regions and the communities of this state. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. Right now, know that there's a very good chance that you are qualified to be on the Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission. Every registered voter is, unless they have a conflict of interest, like if they're an elected party official or a lobbyist, something like that. The whole point is to take the process out of the hands of people who stand to directly benefit from manipulated maps. So if you're qualified to apply, you might be wondering right now, what exactly am I signing up to do? Commissioners will conduct public hearings around the state, so obviously some travel will definitely be involved. Keep in mind, the commission will have its own budget and it sets its own policies, including travel reimbursement. I would say listening is probably the most important thing that commissioners will do. So if you're interested in hearing the concerns of your fellow Michiganders, this is probably a good job for you. Commissioners will learn from experts they'll hire, just like the legislature has always hired map drawing experts in the past. The difference now will be that the Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission will be working to get representation for all of Michigan's communities, not trying to manipulate the maps for political gain. The commissioners will have to work closely together to find consensus, and then they'll conduct another series of public hearings, at least 5 are required, to explain their decision-making process. So let's talk a little bit more about why you should consider applying to serve on the Redistricting Commission and why you should spread the word to as many people as you can in case they would like to apply too. First of all, it's a really unique career opportunity. Only 13 people in the entire world will be able to put on their resume that they served on Michigan's very first Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission. Being on the commission is a full-time commitment until the redistricting process and litigation, if any, is resolved, so that's probably around 2 years. Commissioners have to be compensated with at least 25% of the governor's salary. Right now, that means it pays $39,825 a year. And if you leave your job to serve, your employer is required to hold your job until you're done. There's no experience necessary at all. You don't have to have a background in statistics or map technology or anything like that. As one of the California redistricting commissioners put it, everybody brings something to the commission, no matter their background or their knowledge. You don't need to have a PhD or years of experience. The commission will have access to all the necessary data and the funding to hire specialists who are map and data experts. As a member of the commission, you would do the hiring, and you'd get the answers you'd need to draw the maps fairly with input from citizens all around the state. Mostly, you've got to be committed to fair maps for all Michiganders, and you need to be willing to listen and consider their concerns. And you need to be willing and able to work together with your fellow commissioners to come to a consensus on voting district lines that are fair to everybody. One really important reason you should apply is because the redistricting process needs your individual voice. A successful commission is one that truly represents Michigan. Remember, there are 13 spots picked essentially at random from all of the applications. So there's 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and 5 who align with neither major party. When the applicant pool is narrowed to 200 people, the amendment says they have to be weighted geographically and demographically. But that will work best if the applicant pool is as big and diverse as possible. Finally, you should apply because you can. We fought hard to win back this power for the voters, to draw the lines. Volunteers collected more than 425,000 signatures in just 4 months in 2017. And then those volunteers and more knocked 465,000 doors in 2018. More than 14,000 individual donors contributed to the campaign, and in the end, more than 2.5 million Michigan voters supported Proposal 2. That was a lot of numbers to throw out at you, but the point is, it wasn't easy to reform Michigan's redistricting process, but it was absolutely worth it to give you the power to decide how Michigan's voting maps are drawn. Now it's time for us to exercise that power, and that involves participating in the process. As we know, democracy is not a spectator sport. It's critical to show up and vote, but it's just simply not enough. Politicians and special interests hoped we wouldn't notice that the election maps were rigged, that our representatives weren't listening to us. They hoped we'd just go along with the system. But we Michiganders rejected that notion, and it's not time to rest on the sidelines now. We have to be active participants in the process. We've got to prove to everybody who says citizens can't and shouldn't draw the lines here in Michigan and around the country that we can do it and we can do it right. So hopefully that was enough information for you to decide that you want to apply and spread the word to others who might be interested in applying too. Here's how the process will unfold over the coming months through 2022. So first of all, the application process is expected to open in late 2019. In fact, it's exciting, the Secretary of State has already released a draft version of the application that's open for public comment. So you can find that and other important information if you go to votersnotpoliticians.com/SOS, and that will redirect you to the Secretary of State's website. By the way, after the webinar, you will get an email with some important links and the recording of the webinar, so you don't have to really scurry around to write down links if I talk about them. Voters Not Politicians will hold in-person application workshops starting this fall and through the application period to help voters fill out applications completely and accurately. Those applications will have to be notarized, so Voters Not Politicians is also making a plan to help with that. The application period closes June 1st, 2020, and then by September, the commissioners will be selected through the random processes spelled out in the amendment. The commission will convene in October, and then they'll begin their training. There are a lot of organizations who are supporting the census in 2020, and Voters Not Politicians cares very much about that process. The Redistricting Commission has to have an accurate count in order to draw fair maps. I just want to make a special note here. The commission application process actually opens before the census happens in the spring of 2020. So by the time the census data is available, the commission will already be working and they'll be ready and waiting for that data to arrive. By January of 2021, or even earlier, the commission will begin holding public hearings across Michigan. Remember, everybody is welcome and encouraged to participate in that process, or they can submit their concerns and thoughts to the commission online. Only 13 people will serve on the commission, but every Michigander can and should have input on how the maps are drawn. In February, when the census data becomes available, the commission can then begin working on the maps. Really, this means deciding what data and information will be put into the computer programs that will draw the maps. They'll approve the final versions of the maps in November. And in 2022, very exciting, we will have elections using the new, fair, impartial, representative maps approved by the commission. Thanks to the hard-fought win for democracy last November, Michigan's redistricting process now involves all of us in a fair, transparent process instead of just a few people deciding future election outcomes in secret. So I'm going to take a moment to answer right now a frequently asked question. How does the US Supreme Court decision affect Michigan's redistricting situation? You've probably heard there was a lawsuit brought by the League of Women Voters of Michigan that challenged Michigan's current voting maps as being unfairly drawn for political advantage. A federal court agreed that our maps were unconstitutionally gerrymandered. And the Supreme Court actually didn't disagree with that, but they did say that federal courts were outside of their jurisdiction. That means Michigan will not get new maps for 2020, but the decision does not affect what we voted for in Proposal 2. In fact, the Supreme Court called out independent commissions as one remedy for the problem of gerrymandering. So the independent citizens redistricting process is now part of Michigan's state constitution. It is the law of the land in Michigan. So the applications will be available this year, later this year. The commission will be seated in 2020, and the commission's maps will be used in the 2022 election cycle. So how do you get involved right now? Voters Not Politicians wants to know if you're interested in applying for the commission. So one option you have is to text Draw the Line to 555-888. Another option is to go to votersnotpoliticians.com/draw-the-line. You can also just sort of navigate through, if you click on Our Work and then Apply to Serve, you can also get there through normal navigation on the website. After you sign up there, we will send you updates and we'll let you know when applications are available, how to get help applying, and then we'll give you helpful tips. By the way, when you're signing up, you may want to know why we need your street address. We have a goal of getting 10,000 people to sign up as interested in applying. That will kind of match the 10,000 invitations that will be sent out by the Secretary of State. And we need to make sure that we have a geographically diverse list. So later this year, if we see, for example, that we don't have enough people interested in, I don't know, Pontiac or Traverse City or Kalamazoo or Escanaba, we'll get moving to talk to more people in those particular places. Maybe you want to do a little reading up. No problem. That's what informed citizens do. We have lots more information on the Voters Not Politicians website. You can also follow the instructions on your screen to get to the Secretary of State's page that has more details on the commission application process. While you're at the Voters Not Politicians website, you can consider donating or volunteering to make sure that as many Michiganders as possible get the information that you're getting now. We've been focusing on the redistricting process tonight, but this is a really exciting time in Michigan for other reasons too. We have both the opportunity and I would say the responsibility to move our state toward a government that truly represents the people. So first, we need to support the census process. We need to make sure everybody understands how important it is to be counted. A complete count of all people in Michigan is critical to the redistricting process. And it's also critical to making sure Michigan gets all the funding that it's entitled to. Next, we need to participate in Michigan's new redistricting process by sharing information, by considering applying to serve, and by interacting with the commission through the open website and the public hearings. And third, we have to make sure everybody's aware of their new voting rights that we passed in Proposal 3 last November, including automatic registration, same-day registration, and no reason absentee voting. Michigan's access to the ballot has never been easier, but we have to stay engaged with the process in order to move Michigan toward full participation in our democracy. You can get more information about the census by searching for Be Counted Michigan 2020. You can get more information about your new voting access either at the ACLU of Michigan or the Michigan Secretary of State websites. And we'll email you some of those helpful links along with the recording of this webinar. Together, these represent a really big step forward in Michigan that lives up to the first line of our state constitution: all political power is inherent in the people. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we move into the question and answer session, I just want to remind you that you can find additional resources through our website, including lots of information about the new process, applying to serve on the commission, and more. And you can actually get the full text of the amendment if you like. That's actually in the footer of the website under language. Also in the footer of the website, you can request one of our trained speakers to give this presentation to your group or organization. So if you scroll down again to the very bottom of votersnotpoliticians.com, you can request a speaker to give this presentation. And again, all the website links will be emailed to you later. So here's the information again about how to sign up for information about applying for the commission. We'll make sure you get the application, and we'll also get you additional information and how to find somebody to notarize your application. We will only use this list to communicate information about applying for the Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission unless you opt in to other communication from Voters Not Politicians. So now we're going to start answering your questions. I'm joined today by Scott Reynolds, who was part of the policy committee that drafted the amendment language, and he also heads up our current policy committee. He is the Human Resources Director and Inside Counsel for a nonprofit hospice, and he was also one of our regional field directors during the campaign. So if you have questions for us, please type those into the chat window. Amelia, what's our first question?
So our first question is for Scott. And the first question is, are precinct delegates ineligible for the commission? Oh, Scott, we can hear you now.
Okay, good. I was just saying to the screen, you have to unmute me, huh? So the question, if I heard it correctly, because I was typing at the same time to tell you to unmute me, it was about precinct delegates?
Correct.
Okay. At this juncture, it has been determined that they would be excluded from participation in the commission. Although I will note that the Secretary of State has posted a draft application as well as a explanation, if you will, of some of the language and criteria. And in there, they have a specific answer regarding the precinct delegate. However, it's open for public comment. So if someone feels that should be included, or there's some sort of additional question, they can certainly contact the Secretary of State office regarding, as part of the public comment. So I direct people to do that if they're want some follow-up.
Thank you, Scott. And before we move on to the next question, I do want to point out to everyone that the chat window, it's a little icon that looks like a talk bubble with dots in it. You should see that icon at the bottom of your screen below the presentation. If you don't see it, kind of hover around at the bottom. The toolbar may be automatically disappearing for you, but just click that chat window and send us a chat, and we'll be able to read that out loud for you. All right, the second question is also for Scott. Will due-paying members of political parties be required to be assigned to a political segment of the commission? So I think this question is asking if a due-paying member of a political party will be bucketed into a Republican or a Democrat.
Well, that's an interesting question. I guess as far as I am aware, nothing on the application asks if you're a dues-paying member of a political party. It simply asks whether or not you affiliate with a particular party or none at all. And based on that information, it would determine which bucket you go into. I would think that if you are a dues-paying member of a party, that's probably who you affiliate with. But I guess that determination would, ultimately be yours to make. If you donated in the past, let's say, to the Democratic Party, but you've had a change of heart before the applications come out, and now you consider yourself a Republican or maybe an independent, then you could certainly attest that that's how you affiliate, and that's the extent of it. No one's going to look into your dues paying history. So I guess that's how I would respond to that.
Okay. And then our next question is for Jamie. What if the state legislators decline to fund the commission?
So that question, so what if the state legislators decline to fund the commission? The answer is they can't. The amendment clearly requires that the commission have funding equivalent to 25% of the Secretary of State's budget. So the only way they could completely decline to fund the commission would be to cut the Secretary of State's entire budget to zero. And I don't think anybody thinks they're going to do that. Right now, the budget negotiations are still underway, as you've probably heard in the news. There are a couple of different proposals. The Senate budget actually gave full funding, the same amount of funding that the governor's budget had for the commission, but cut the Secretary of State's budget by that equal amount. So, obviously jeopardizing election protection and other important budget items. And then the House actually reduced the entire Secretary of State's budget so that the commission's funding would actually be reduced. And that was by about, I think, $1 million less than what was in Governor Whitmer's budget. So there's some risk that it will be a little bit lower than anticipated, but the team of which Scott was a part that wrote the amendment made sure that that funding could not be completely denied.
Great. And then the next question is for Scott. What if the commission cannot agree on a map?
The amendment has a provision for tie breaking. So if they can't agree, I won't get into the weeds on it, but there's actually a mechanism within the amendment that allows for basically ranked choice voting type of operation. And ultimately, if the commission is completely deadlocked and really can't settle on one, then one of the final maps, I believe, is randomly drawn that meets the criteria by the Secretary of State's office. And that's how the final map would be done. And I'm sorry to everyone, my computer, I think, is the one that's doing the dinging, and I can't figure out how to shut it off. But I should note that under no circumstances, however, is anyone outside of the commission permitted to draw the maps. So under the current process, the courts ultimately are able to do that. Or, if the legislature, let's say, for instance, was locked underneath our amendment, the most the courts could do would be to turn it back over to the commission to draw the map. So there's no way that they would be able to take that power away from the commission, and ultimately the maps would come out of the commission process.
All right. Our next question: what if a commissioner needs to drop off the commission? Can a runner-up just step in and take over? And Scott, will send that one over to you.
Okay. The commission doesn't, I guess a good way of thinking about this is a jury selection system where you oftentimes have what are called alternate jurors who can step in to the jury should someone be disqualified or otherwise have to come out of the jury process. The commission is not set up that way. The commission just has the 13 members. However, if someone has to step away or is otherwise removed, the Secretary of State would draw randomly from the pool of applicants that was used to select the commission. They would just go into a relevant group of people, whether it was the independent, Republican, and Democrat, and randomly choose one of those individuals to take that person's position.
All right. And then our next question, I'll send this one over to Jamie. What is the time commitment in hours, weeks, or months?
So it's expected to be a full-time position. We do understand, because they have to do the public hearings, I think that time won't necessarily be completely limited to sort of a 9 to 5, 5-day a week sort of job description. But we do expect it to be a full-time commitment. I do know that there were people we've heard from in the California Commission who did maintain their current job on top of the commission job. I think it can be done, but it would be a very huge draw on your time. Again, I would direct you to the fact that the commission can set its own policies. The commission runs itself and can, set an appropriate work schedule that works for the people who are in it.
All right, our next question. And I'm going to summarize this because it's pretty long, but history has shown that parties, especially the majority parties, will try to subvert the core mission of a redistricting commission. Is there anything in the tea leaves about what this next commission can expect in this regard?
I can jump in on that, but Scott, I may throw it to you for a little more detail. So the amendment was really carefully written. Part of the reason that we're doing all this work, though, to make sure as many people apply for the commission as possible, is that makes it more likely that it will be filled with good actors who legitimately want to have a fair outcome. They want fair maps for the state of Michigan. So that's part of the reason that we want a huge, diverse applicant pool. And again, the work of the commission is really protected. The Secretary of State has sort of ministerial administrative duties, but the commission runs itself and is answerable to you, to the public. All of their work will be done completely in public. It will be transparent. All meetings have to be public. All their business has to be public. So it's really kind of hard to interfere with it. Scott, do you have anything to add to that?
Scott, you should be unmuted.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I've been trying to mute my computer here so I wouldn't ding people. But no, I think you did a good job of summarizing the reasons why. I guess I would put it this way, that it's not a matter of if we get sued or the commission gets sued or some sort of legal action is taken. It's just a matter of when and what form or challenge it will take. The Supreme Court has already dealt with some of those challenges, some of the more significant ones, and I'm talking about the Michigan Supreme Court specifically. But I would expect that we will see, or the commission will see, or the Secretary of State will see some sort of legal challenge to it. I could speculate on any number of areas they might go after, but I guess I'll just leave that alone for right now, and we'll just see it when it comes. But just don't be surprised. And it will be politically motivated. There's no doubt about it.
All right, Scott, the next question is for you as well. What if I have voted for both Republicans and Democrats in the past? What are guidelines to determine what political affiliation I should apply for?
Boy, you're just stuck, I guess. But no, just kidding. It's really not a problem. When you fill out the application or you send an application in, if you were mailed one, you're going to be asked to attest to which party you affiliate with. And that, I guess what it boils down to is an honor system. Michigan doesn't require you to register for a political party. It's simply, which is why we're doing it that way, or why the amendment's set up that way. So when you go before and fill out the application and basically say, I affiliate with a Republican or Democratic Party or neither, you're going to be taken at your word. And I guess there's no firm criteria. I think most voters or citizens understand which way they lean. And it doesn't matter, let's say, if you voted for a Republican for president, but you've always voted for Democratic governor, for instance, or whatever. A lot of people vote kind of in that pattern. I think, you have to kind of look at yourself and say, okay, which party most represents the ideals that I believe in, and which party, do I identify with? Where do I spend my resources, my time? And I think for most people, that's a fairly easy call. So just trust your heart and be honest.
And Scott, I'm just going to jump in there. This is Jamie. Wouldn't you say that if somebody really votes issues and tends to vote for people in both parties, that they would check the box for being not affiliated with either party?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the definition of an independent in some ways, right? So then it would be neither party, and you could truly call yourself an independent.
Great.
All right, the next question, Jamie, I'll throw this one to you. Will there be scheduled breaks so that people can go on personal vacations while serving on the commission?
Again, I can come back to the fact that the commission will create its own policies and rules. They may decide to set a particular schedule for people to have a break especially between all the hearings that they have to do. They may decide that their representative from the west side of the UP can Skype into their public meetings. They really have the freedom to set their own policies and rules to make sure that it works for them.
Great. And Jamie, I will also throw this question to you. What will be included in the training, and how much time will be invested in training prior to the work itself?
There's a lot of training that has already been created. There's kind of an amazing handbook that the Princeton, is it the Wilson School, I think? The Wilson Graduate School of Public Policy at Princeton has created a commissioner's handbook, which is kind of amazing. They did a graduate project based on the Michigan Amendment and have created this handbook to get people started. They'll also be able to do some research. One of the things that the commission can do is use the 2010 census data, so the census data from a decade ago, to practice. They can actually try drawing maps, work together to do that. But we also, that's one of the roles that Voters Not Politicians intends to fill, is to provide commissioner training in over and above, or at least to complement what's provided by the Secretary of State.
Great. And the next question I will send over to Scott. If you happen to be in the final 200 in the applicant pool, what is the process for choosing the final 13?
Okay, so once you get the pool down to 200, then the majority and minority leaders from the two major parties in Michigan, so at this point that's the Republican and Democratic parties. So there's 4 of those individuals, the majority and minority leaders, and they would each be able to basically kick off 5 people each, so a total of 20 from that pool of 200. And the rationale behind that is that they would have done some research and understand maybe who had lied on their application and made it that far, and who they felt was maybe a partisan person for the other party, and they would go ahead and disqualify them. Now, they don't have to disqualify anyone, however they can. And again, it's a lot like jury selection, where they can simply say, we want so-and-so removed from the list, and that would be the end of it. So there would be ultimately 180 names, potentially. Again, they don't have to disqualify anyone, so it could be a number greater than that. But if each one of them did exercise those 5, then you would have a pool of 180. At that point, the Secretary of State's office would randomly draw the 13 names from that 180 person pool, and they would do so such that, as Amy indicated, there would be 4 from the Republican Party, 4 from the Democratic Party, and 5 that identified with neither party or belonged to a third party, or whatever the case might be. And that's how they would be drawn down to the 13 people.
All right. And then another question, Scott, I'll send this one to you. Is age a disqualifier to serve on the commission?
As long as you are 18 or older, I believe you're eligible to serve on the commission. I guess to anticipate another question would be whether or not you were an emancipated individual. And as I sit here right now, I can't answer that, but I do believe 18 would be the cutoff.
Okay, and the final question that we do have so far in the chat window is, oh, and we just got another. So Scott, will people know if they make it to the pool of 200?
That is going to be a determination for the Secretary of State's office as to when they make those names public. And I don't know what their final decision is going to be. There was no provision for that explicitly in the amendment, so I guess I'll defer to the Secretary of State's office for that. But I'm sure at some point the people would be notified. I just don't know at what level, whether it be 200 or the 180. Common sense would, I guess, dictate that maybe it's the 200, but maybe they'll wait till the whole commission's chosen of 13. You know, that's really there to call.
Great. And then Scott and Jamie, this question is for both of you. But could you give some examples of communities of interest?
Jamie, you want to go first?
Sure. So communities of interest could be, they could be school districts, they could be affiliated businesses, like it could be a community of farmers. We heard about communities of interest from California's experience, grape growers, and then the premium grape growers. It's anybody who wants to make sure that they're heard and that they have representation in the process. So that's part of the point, is that that's up to citizens to bring themselves to the commission as a community of interest. That's the point of the 10 public hearings and the open process that, that the commission will have to decide. Scott, do you have more examples?
It could be cultural identification. So maybe there's a pocket of individuals who identify economically or culturally. Sometimes it could be areas covered by a common school district or news source. I mean, it depends on which size district you're talking about. Obviously, a U.S. congressional district is a lot larger than a state one, and so therefore, there's not going to necessarily be one defining characteristic for that community of interest. But I think the most important thing that to remember here is what Jamie talked about during the presentation, is that the citizens themselves get to choose what their community of interest looks like. So through the public hearing process, different individuals, different groups are going to come forward, and they're going to say, here's who I identify with and why. And this is why I think that this should be my congressional district or our congressional district. Now, obviously, there's not going to be 100% agreement on what those districts should look like by the citizens living there, simply because, they are quite large. And even if they weren't quite large, there's going to be some disagreement over that. But at the end of the day, the citizens are going to speak, and the commission's going to take that information, and based on the quality of it and the quantity of it, they're going to use that information to define that community of interest based on what the people told them. And it's also important to remember that once the maps are drawn, the draft maps, the commission will go back out into the field to make a public presentation and make those maps available so that any individual in the state of Michigan can run the same data and look at the maps to see if they were drawn fairly and according to the community of interest, and also comment back on whether or not that community of interest as drawn, or that district as drawn, truly reflects what they told the commission. So yeah, it can be a variety of things, as Jamie alluded to, but in the end, the important thing is the citizens will define it based on their ties, not for political reasons based on getting votes.
One thing I just want to jump in and add is that I heard an interesting story, again, from California. We keep pointing to California just because they have a very similar redistricting commission that started one census cycle ago. But they had a bunch of districts that were drawn sort of north-south. And they were finding that the roads that ran east-west were not being taken care of as well as the north-south roads because they were in too many different representatives districts and nobody was going to bat for those particular roads. So the point is that it's kind of hard to predict what some people might think is a community of interest or something that needs representation, and that's why we listen to the public.
Great. And I do want to point out that if you do have a question following the end of this call, you can always send us questions to info@votersnotpoliticians.com. And Jamie, I'll let you end our first webinar.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Thank you very much for tuning in. We hope to have more webinars in the future, but this one will also be recorded and it will be sent back out to you, as we mentioned, with some helpful links, and it will also be posted on our YouTube channel in case you want to refer other people to it. Thanks again for joining us and have a great night.